foreign, so to say, entirely. So please start. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I might have certain network issues, so I'll just put my video off. And I must confess, I haven't presented before, so I'll try presenting because that's important.
Okay, which one?
Please go ahead.
Audio.
Yes, ma'am, sure.
Mic, ma'am. Headphone.
Is the presentation visible?
If you have a PowerPoint presentation, we cannot see it just now.
Okay, ma'am. Give me 2 minutes. I'll try it. Okay, is it visible now?
Yes, yes. Now
Okay,
we
ma'am.
can.
Thank you. Let me start now. So good morning, everyone. This is the first paper for this session on the reception of Persian poetics in the South Asian context. Let me confess at the very outset that I am not at all conversant in Arabic or Persian. My paper is entitled Study Farsi and Sell Oil, the Indian Pindesicle and the Feminization of Farsi. And it will try to look at the historical linguistic shift from Farsi to English and the mechanism of the shift and the reactions of the people, especially the Indian women, to it, as is evident in some of the texts situated in this period. For this purpose, let us look at Ismat Chuktai's A Life in Words and a Bengali text, Ashapurna Devi's Prothom Pratishruti. So let me clarify the title. Study Farsi and Sell Oil was a popular late 19th and early 20th century adage. This reveals a lot about the loss of importance that Farsi is facing in this period. I read about it for the first time in Ismat Chuktai's memoirs. In her essay, Dust of the Caravan, Ismat narrates how her civil servant father went against his elder brother's dictum that urged to teach the children Farsi. Ismat's father did not let his sons learn Farsi. They learned English instead. But he let his daughters learn it. Gauging from Ismat's birth in 1915 and the fact that she was the youngest daughter and the ninth of her 10 siblings, it becomes evident that this conflict between Ismat's father and his elder brother, Ismat called him Kaya Abba, let us call him so too for convenience, took place around the Findesicle. So what is the Findesicle? It is the turn of the century, more specifically from the 19th to the 20th century. This is important for us because it is the time when the educational changes, the shift from Farsi to English, are gradually setting in among the masses of India. This is the time when the people realize and significantly react to the shift. We'll come back to this a little later. Why feminization of Farsi? As is evident from Ismat's memoirs, Farsi, having lost its importance in the public sphere, became a fitting study for the daughters of fashionable middle-class fathers. The fact that Ismat and her elder sisters learned Farsi instead of their brothers hints that there is a rhetoric of femininity being associated to Farsi. So, is Farsi a masculine or a feminine accomplishment after all? Before getting into that, let us look into a bit of theory. According to Mikhail Bakhtin, the centripetal forces of the life of language embodied in a unitary language operate in the midst of heteroglossia. At any given moment in its evolution, language is stratified not only into linguistic dialects but also into languages that are socio-ideological, languages of social groups, professional and generic languages, languages of generations, and so forth. Quite easily, it can be understood that language is associated with a sense of power, and the difference in power between the man and the woman is often reflected in the way they use language. Some researchers point out that women's language in the formal spheres is often over-formal, and this hints at their supposed vulnerability And again, in the informal sectors, and informal sectors for most women exclusively means a company which is exclusively feminine. And there, their language is Adi, colloquial, but they are mostly reflective of their relational identities as a wife or a mother. In her study on Begamati Zuban, or the Urdu that the women of Agra used in their homes in the 19th century, Gail Minoj notes that this Urdu has a lesser influence of Persian on it. She assumes this to be the effect of the lack of education among the women. Quite evidently, then, Farsi was associated with higher education in the 19th century, and higher education was a privilege only a handful of men could afford. Farsi, then, in the 19th century, was a masculine accomplishment. But towards the end of that century, the scenario undergoes a gulf change. Ismat Chugtai recollects, my sisters were adept in housekeeping. They were not only proficient in Urdu, Farsi, and the Quran, but also in sewing, embroidery, and cooking. It is interesting to note that proficiency in Farsi is mentioned along with the expertise in sewing, embroidery, cooking, and housekeeping, all feminine accomplishments. Quite clearly, then, Farsi by the turn of the century is no longer a masculine accomplishment but a feminine one. Since language is linked to a sense of power, this shift to Farsi can be seen as a loss of its importance. This loss of importance is something that baffles the interiorized sections of Indian society. We have already seen how the elderlies like Taya Abba react to it, and we'll soon come to see how a rural Bengali woman, Shiv Jaya, reacts similarly to it as we look into Pratham Pratishruti. So, theory done, let us look into a little bit of history. By the time this shift was happening, Farsi had enjoyed the privilege of an administrative language in India for several centuries, ever since the Delhi Sultanate, followed by the Mughal Empire. With the conquest of the Ghoris, the spread of Farsi and Arabic education began in India, as the historian Irfan Habib points out. Primary education took place at the Maktab, and then at the Madrasa, the students gained expertise in different fields of knowledge. The educational system did not undergo much structural change in the Mughal period either. Farsi was the medium of education, instruction in most cases, and the administrative language. By the time of the Mughals, Habib emphasizes Farsi educated people in India equaled or even surpassed the same in Iran. Not only was the language important in the Mughal courts, but Farsi influences are also seen in the administrative language of the Rajput courts. And then, as the East India Company started gaining political power in the late 18th century, there emerged a pressing need for suitable pundits and Maulvis to help judges in the administration of justice. It was therefore decided to encourage the study of Sanskrit and Persian among the Indians. Under their initiative, the Calcutta Madrasa was founded in 1781 and the Sanskrit College at Benares was founded in 1792. Though the Orientalists supported this move, by the early phases of the 19th century, a need for Indian clerks, translators, and lower administrative officials became pressing, and these positions required the knowledge of English. Consequently, throughout the early 19th century, changes in the educational system in India was on cards. The middle class, whose life chances were inextricably linked to the colonial system, supported this move. This includes famous names like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, and on the governmental level, Macaulay's minutes clinched the issue in favor of English education by declaring Farsi or Sanskrit to be incapable for administrative usage. Finally, in 1854, Wood's Dispatch established English as the mode of instruction in India. So, quite clearly, the changes in the educational system took place by the middle of the century. A general query in that case, why are we looking at the fin de siècle when the changes actually took place quite a long time back? The answer is threefold. One, government legislations are kind of inherently detached from people. They take quite some time to settle among the masses. Two, though the changes took place by the middle of the century, the Muslim community remained by and large out of its regime, as it were. So, it was only with the intervention of Sir Syed Ahmed in the 1870s that the reason behind the underrepresentation of the Muslims in the government could be found, and quite predictably, it was because of their lack of knowledge of English. So gradually, only after this intervention, Muslim participation in the new education system became significant. Finally, the middle class household represented by the middle class women was the most interiorized section of Indian society, religiously kept insulated from any external influence. Any change in the external sphere took a long time to percolate into the middle class homes. Since our discussion focuses basically upon the interactions between women and Farsi, specifically middle class women, both Hindu and Muslim, by the time the interaction becomes significant enough for a historical study, the Findicicle has begun. Coming back to our texts, it is rather important to note that the two texts are very different. Ismat's memoirs, being set in various important cities of western and northern India, gives a view of the new urban Muslim middle class. This opens up a panoramic view of the urban middle class circles of India. By contrast, Protham Pratishruti, a fiction, is largely set in the landed, rural, upper caste Hindu households of Bengal. But in spite of their differences, the two texts are set in the similar times and both are from the perspectives of women. So let's look into Ismat's recollections. Dust of the Caravan is the opening essay in A Life in Words. For our purpose, this essay suffices. Ismat calls her civil servant father a liberal. In her characteristic humor, Ismat notes, "My father was a liberal. On principle, he safeguarded the rights of girls more than those of boys. But in practice, girls and boys were equal in the same way as Hindus and Muslims were brothers." Ismat's satire is easily observable here. Let's not get further into that. But Ismat's satirical view of the liberal English educated middle class lays bare the artificiality or the hypocrisy of the Western liberalism that these people were practicing. They still felt the public sphere was the sphere of the men, and because higher education and English education smoothened the journey in the public sphere, they were necessary for the men. But because the women had no role there, they were a different matter, as Ismat notes. So, a language like Farsi, that the men did not learn anymore because it had no role in the public sphere, became the fitting study for a woman. Hence, Farsi becomes a feminine accomplishment. But there was something more than that. Taya Abba is neither a representative of the new middle class nor a liberal. Rather, he is a representative of the fading social order. He is still proud of his Mughal ancestry. He considers Farsi his mother tongue, though Ismat notes Farsi was not the spoken language of her family. He did not let his sons learn English. They were fluent in Farsi, but they did not get jobs. Taya Abba died almost penniless, but by refusing to let his sons learn English, it is as if he is revolting against the new order. But his final ordeal and the joblessness of his sons seem to explain why the adage study Farsi and sell oil became so popular at that time. Ismat recollects her Farsi learning was associated with the regular tauntings of her brothers that ashamed her. This rhetoric of shame, regressiveness, inferiority, or degradation that came to be associated to Farsi further took it away from the public sphere. Farsi was something useless or degrading for men in the public conception. Hence, it was a fitting study for the women. Hence, English became the language of progressive middle class men, and Farsi became the language of their fashionable wives or daughters. Our next text, Prothabati by Ashapurna Devi, is a very unlikely choice for this paper. Satyavati is the only daughter of the Kaviraj Ramkali Chatterjee. Her father spent his formative years in a bigger city but then came back to his village. Naturally, his thoughts seem more liberal than his village fellows, and he goes against rural prejudices to educate his only daughter. However, Satyavati gets married quite early and her formal education is impossible, but she educates herself informally. She has the desire to become a part of the urban middle class. Her husband, a village lad Nobokumar, zestfully learns English. He imbibes certain Western, so to speak, liberal values as well. But his English learning is quite unaccepted by his family. The clothes he wears to his English lessons have to be kept separate, and he has to bathe thoroughly before entering the house. This reveals a certain level of profanity associated to English in the rural society. Isn't the generation gap between Nobokumar and his family similar to the generation gap between Ismat's father and Taya Abba? Later in the text, Shottavati and Nobokumar settle in Calcutta. Nobokumar easily gets a job in Calcutta because of his knowledge of English, but before going there, they visit Shottavati's parental home. There, Shottavati engages in conversations among the women of the large house, learning about their prioritization of their son's education, especially Western education. Ramkali's aunt, Mokhoda, observes, "It's really good that you have hatched this plan. Nowadays, everyone praises English education." And she is interrupted by Shibjaya, her sister-in-law. Shibjaya is surprised and blurts out, "That's a new one. I tell you, all this while it was Bengali and Sanskrit and Persian for the learned. And now you're telling me that one has to learn the Mleccha's language." Someone interrupts her, "Persian is Mleccha too." And the highly confused Shibjaya responds, "All my life I have heard Persian spoken. I never knew it was Mleccha." The concept of mleccho is very important in this context. Mleccho is the derogatory term for anything non-Indian. There is a level of profanity attached to this term. The English language, so valued in the public sphere, is still mleccho in the private sphere. This brings in the homeworld dichotomy that Partha Chatterjee so clearly explains in his essays on the women's question. The upper caste middle class household is supposed to be insulated from Western influences. Colonized in the external sphere, home became the repository of Indian values and the women became its emblem. Hence, when the interiorized woman Shibjaya calls English foreign, she confirms the foreignness of English, and by calling Farsi Indian, she again confirms the Indianness of Farsi. Quite evidently, Shibjaya and Taya Abba are voicing similar sentiments. Both of them consider Farsi Indian, but neither of them has any role to play in the administration. But they represent the general mass of India. They voice the general sentiments of India. They confirm the Indianness of Farsi. Before ending, I'll only recapitulate the issue of feminization of Farsi very briefly. As I've already explained how Farsi became a feminine language, we must note that Shibjaya's case gives this feminization a further overtone. Farsi by this time became a women's language. The more progressive ones learned it, and the lesser progressive ones still called it Indian. So, finally, I call the feminization or the interiorization of Farsi to be a proleptic reference to its final erasure from the Indian scene. As Leela Gandhi points out, decolonization is a post-colonial myth. Western modernity is something that post-independence India cannot overcome, especially in the age of globalization. Though neither English nor Farsi are a part of the scheduled languages of India, there are claims to include English in it. But the same is not true for Farsi. From the end of the last century, the women's representation in public sphere has significantly increased, but the women have to conform with the masculine and Western hegemony that determine the code of conduct in the public sphere. Hence, the women too at present learn Farsi only amateurishly, and this perhaps is the greatest proof or impact of its erasure. Actually, the thing is that Farsi, even ever since it became feminized, became amateur because the education of women was amateur in itself. At present, women's education is not that amateur anymore, but Farsi still remains amateur. So finally, I hope this paper explains the link between feminization and interiorization and erasure. A language that has been so important in India for centuries could not be erased in one day by one legislation. If a wave of standardization can lead to such fate of a language as important as Farsi, it remains to be seen if the other vernaculars of India are at present facing the similar threats of marginalization in the face of cultural globalization. Thank you for your time and patience. I hope the discussion has been meaningful for my listeners.
Thank you, Konkuna. And I'm hoping that all of us who are participating in this presentation session have noted down observations and comments, and we'll have them after Mars has also finished his presentation. So we are going to be jumping from Farsi and the turn of the last century to something which has to do with roughly the same period of time. And we now have the second presentation by Maz bin Bilal, who teaches at the Jindal Global University. He's a translator and also a writer, and his paper is entitled Banaras in the Persian Cosmopolis, Mirza Ghalib's Chirag-e-Der. So, Maz, we look forward to your presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Qazi, and thank you, Clay, for having me here. I'll begin straight away. First, I'll thank actually Konkana as well for she set up this idea, this notion of Persian as an Indian language. I attended the two first plenaries yesterday, and those plenaries made me rethink the concept behind this conference itself, the very title of it. So therefore, I'm going to actually try to place Chirag there and in Persian discourse as large, in the Persian cosmopolis, but also the Persian cosmopolis itself with regard to India. And that motivation has arisen since yesterday, since I attended the first two plenaries. I'm afraid I couldn't attend the roundtable or the third plenary as well because I had a class to teach at my university. And I believe Professor Keshav Murthy's talk would have been different in tenor from the first two plenaries that I attended. I don't know what the roundtable was about. When I had seen the title of the conference, which is Persian Arabic Poetics in the Context of Indian Poetics, Reading Recoveries and Reorientations in South Asian Literature, all of you know this, I'm just repeating it because I'm going to parse it a little. I'm going to break it up. I approached this in good faith. I thought Persian Arabic poetics in the context of Indian poetics meant a kind of poetics that had existed in India for close to 1,000 years, which included the Sabak-e-Hindi, which, as Konkana is arguing, continues to exist, perhaps in a more amateur sense now, because the professionalization has gone away. Due to various historical forces, Konkana summarize some of them, some perhaps I'll also try to contribute towards in the discussion later. But what I discovered in the two plenaries was that it was almost as if a dichotomy was being set up between the Persian Arabic poetics versus the context of Indian poetics, as if these are two entirely different things and one must be in dialogue with the other. This I take some objection to. It was called, so Professor Kapoor almost wholly focused on Sanskrit poetics with barely a mention of the Persianate, which I'm not sure how it linked to the conference. Mr. Hegde, on the other hand, he drew an interesting binary between the Persian cruel beloved versus the Sanskrit Shingara and spoke of hospitality for the other. Again, I'll come to this point in a second after I reiterate that the Persian cosmopolis, this is by historian Richard M. Eaton, who develops the word of Sheldon Pollock on the Sanskrit cosmopolis. He says it's existed in India for 1,000 years, from 900 AD to 1900 AD. One can stretch this a little more if one is to count Iqbal and Faiz as also major proponents and other poets of 20th century India as well, who contributed towards a Persian poetics to be part of the Persian cosmopolis. And I suppose he begins, takes 900 as the year for the Northwest Indian Persianate states that were formed early on. So if you take this into account, and as Konkana was also saying, Persian has been an Indian language for 1,000 years. So then what is this talk of hospitality for the other that Mr. Hegde was talking about? I was a bit unclear about that. Even the currently ongoing and controversial NRC, it makes a person Indian if their family line has been in India for 74 years as of now. Persian, which lived in India for 1,000 years, is it not in itself an Indian poetics then? So that becomes my larger question to the conference organizers, the Comparative Literary Association of India, and the first two plenary speakers whom I heard. So at what point does a linguistic culture become its own? Is 1,000 years not enough? Certainly we are speaking in English right now, we count Indian English as an Indian language. So should we not be considering Persian poetics itself as Indian, at least the Indo-Persian poetics, sabak Hindi, a proponent of which Ghalib is. Why is this happening? I would like to further contend, along with Mannan Ahmed, his recent book, Loss of Hindustan, that this kind of perception of history of Hindustan, that this division of India's history into a duality of an authentic Indian past, which is largely Sanskritic, as opposed to the invaders' violent intervention, is set up by colonial history, appropriating more strongly the Tarikh-e-Farishta. This is the history written by Farishta, who was at the court, at the Deccan court of Bijapur later. This is the only Indian authentic history and, might I add, culture becomes the ancient Indian Sanskrit tradition, whereas another 1,000 years long tradition, that of the Persian cosmopolis, continues to be denied its rightful place. And from here, I segue into what my paper is about, but this sort of places it in the context and that we are talking about and the larger discourse around Indo-Persian poetics. Banaras itself has often become the metonym for ancient as well as contemporary India. It is the city that is even today supposed to symbolize India as a whole. And this, since the city itself, since colonial times, again, since the work of Princeps, with which some of you might be familiar, he was a colonial officer. He's more famously known as the interpreter of Kharoshti and other ancient languages and scripts. He was also posted in Banaras, and he as a city magistrate, I believe, and he carried out a lot of surveys. He did a lot of drawings, and he wrote and illustrated a volume called the Illustrated Banaras. There too, and then all the way down till Diana L. Ek. You see Banaras, Diana L. Ek, who's a contemporary scholar, whose book Banaras City of Light is very, very popular. They've all charted out a history of Banaras largely through ancient times, using texts such as the Kashi Khanda, Kashi Mahatmya, and other Puranic sources. Many of these sources, which were only compiled really effectively in the 16th century. Much of the architecture that exists in Banaras today is that of the 16th century. Even the Maratha Ghats, most of the Ghats are Maratha or Rajput. All of them that exist, they carry elements of Mughal architecture in a strong way, combining different elements in a syncretic way. But the mythology, the history, the discourse that is created around Banaras is largely Sanskritized, and the presence of others such as and of different sources, such as Ghalib's Charaq-e-Der and another major poet, Muhammad Ali Hazim Lahiji, who lived in 18th century Banaras and who was from Persia itself, from Lehja in Iran. Their works are hardly taken into account. The fact that there are over 1,000 shrines, there are over 3,000 temples, there are also 1,000 Muslim shrines which have their own associated discourses. These are not taken into account when describing or writing about Banaras. So this is, I think, a larger part of colonial discourse that we've inherited, and that is an ongoing dichotomous treatment of Indian history and culture that I seek to challenge, not just in my paper. I've also translated Charaq-e-Der, out of which actually the paper has arisen. I've translated it from Persian and Urdu, and also looking at Urdu and Hindi translations alongside into English as Temple Lamp, and this is forthcoming from Penguin hopefully later this year, otherwise next year. So the paper arose from that. But listening to the other speakers yesterday, I was a little confused, if I should, I mean, that's putting it mildly actually, but that we're still talking in these terms where there is a dichotomy being set up between the Indo-Persian and the Sanskrit here. So I'll move on to Mirza Ghalib and Charaq-e-Der itself. Mirza Ghalib migrated, Mirza Ghalib's grandfather migrated to India. So he is also a third generation Indian himself, and he's still writing in Persian. We know him mainly as an Urdu poet, but he wrote 3 times as much in Persian. There's been a recent book by Meher Afshan Farooqi, Ghalib, The Wilderness at My Doorstep, that established this quite strongly in English as well, although of course there is work on his Persian poetry both in Urdu and Persian. itself, but in English, most of the work that had existed had been looking at Ghalib's Urdu poetry so far. Mehrafshah Farooqi's, or some had looked at just Persian. Mehrafshah's book looks at both Urdu and Persian works together. Chirag there then is this Persian Masnavi on Banaras, where he glorifies Banaras not just for the Indian, but also the Persian cosmopolis, not just for the Indian Persian cosmopolis, but for readers stretching from Calcutta to Istanbul. What I mean by the Indian Persian cosmopolis is what Richard M. Eaton speaks of it as, what existed in India, in kingdoms in the Deccan as well, where there were people who were not from Iran, not of that heritage, neither were they Muslim, but were calling themselves sultans. There were Hindus, there were other people from South India who were engaged in this Persian cosmopolis. So Ghalib is writing in Persian, and this is Chirag there is at the cusp almost of his shift from his Urdu writing to his Persian writing in a big way. And he, in his mature days, he wrote mostly in Persian. And Chirag there is written in the year probably 1826, when he is in Banaras towards the end of it that year. He writes it while he's there. He sends some of these verses to different friends of his in different letters. We have a record of those. He wrote more letters more verses than he included in the final poem. In the final poem, he includes 108 verses. So that's a kind of an obeisance to the rosary, to the I'm forgetting the Hindi Sanskrit word is escaping me right now, the Rudraksh, which has 108 beads. So he is very conscious of the Sanskrit and the Hindu traditions also in Banaras, and he is greatly enamored by the city, and he writes a kind of a poem eulogizing Banaras, really. A poem that glorifies the city, glorifies its people, glorifies its traditions, and at the same time he sort of contextualizes it and makes it at one with the larger Persian cosmopolis as well. He makes various comparisons. I'll read out certain verses mainly the translation, but also a few in the original for you in a bit, and that will make clear how what Ghalib's concerns are in the poem, and how he's taking the various traditions of the city into account and merging them with the larger Persian sphere across Asia. So I'll move to reading some of these verses. So first, the first section is where he is talking about how he moves from Delhi to Banaras. And I'm reading verse 18 here. Jahanabad kar nabud alam neest, Jahanabad bada jaye kam neest. Even if I have lost Delhi, why must I grieve? The world prospers, there is no dearth of cities. And then he begins extolling Banaras soon enough. This is verse 24. Sukhan ra nazishe minu pamashi, zigul bange sataishai kashi. Poetry attains its pride of place in heaven when it sings paeans in praise of Kashi. Another verse, I'll not read the originals now, I think just in the interest of time. May God keep Banaras from the evil eye. It is a blessed heaven, paradise under sky. So he's glorifying, he finds it, in other verses he talks of Banaras as a city being in perpetual spring. He compares it to a garden city, which a lot of other historians are also writing or describing the city as at this time. Princeps paintings show us a city that is really green, lush. So not only is he physically enamored by the salubrious nature of the city, he says it's a city of perpetual spring. He is also probably drawing analogies with the Garden of Eden, and this being paradise itself. So these are allusions one can draw. Then he compliments the people of Banaras in various ways also. I've just taken one verse for that here. So I'll quote that one. With the glow of the two worlds, their face is colored like gardens in bloom. Their incandescence lights lamps on the banks of the Ganga. So this is just one verse that's in praise of the people, but there's lots about people, both in terms of bodily terms, but also in spiritual terms. So he's not just focusing on Banaras as a city of spiritual redemption, but also looking at it materially, sensually as well. And then begin these comparisons with the larger Persosphere, and also in a Silk Route kind of manner. So there's a verse that says, someone once compared the beauty of Banaras to China, and since that day, its brow is wrinkled with the bend of the Ganga. It's quite a beautiful verse. And if you notice the Banar, I'm not using a PowerPoint, but I could have shown you on the map, and some of you would be familiar with the major bend in the Ganga that it takes at Banaras. It's a beautiful metaphor, wonderful way to look at it, I think. Another comparison with China occurs in verse 70. Bachin Nabuwad Nigaristan Chui, Bagiti Nist Sharistan Chui. Even in China, there is no such gallery of beauties. No villa comes close the world over, no garden, no heaven. So this is again about the people of Banaras, how beautiful they are to him. Then these are some aspects of the poem. He also, of course, recognizes Kashi and Banaras as major places of pilgrimage for Hindus. He calls it. So first he has this verse where he says even Delhi comes to Banaras and sort of undertakes circles around it. So this city has pride of place in the world. Even Delhi comes to circle around it. This is a quoted ritualistic almost reference to the idea of the Hajj or other rituals where you circumambulate holy places or even the holy fire in Hindu traditions. And then he follows this up with verse 47. Ibadat khana-e naqusiyanast, hamana kaaba-e hindustanast. So the supreme place of worship for the conch blowers. Surely Banaras is the Kaaba of Hindustan. So he's sort of juxtaposing it with both Muslim and Hindu traditions of worship. He is calling it the Kaaba of Hindustan, the most supreme place of worship, and extolling it similarly. And this is again linking to the Silk Route as well in a way. An interesting thing he says later, and this is a longer section, I'm just quoting the last verse of it. He asks clairvoyant Darvesh that the world is so full of sin and evil, why is it not being destroyed by God? Why is doomsday not coming? And this is what the clairvoyant replies. Why is there a delay? He asks, why is there a delay in Israfil blowing the trumpet of doom? Who has stopped judgment day in its track? This is Ghalib asking the clairvoyant. And who replies, pointing to Kashi with a gesture, he smiled and said, it's because of these monuments, this town. And that is Kashi. Finally, it's in Banaras, and it's also true that Ghalib himself never managed to go to Iran. He had a fondness, he had an intense desire to go there. He never completed the Hajj himself. He never went there. But it's in Kashi as if he seems to find that kind of spiritual regeneration, and he juxtaposes Kashi with Iran itself. When your madness reaches complete frenzy, Kashan from Kashi is just a half-step journey. And Kashan is an Iranian city, and that lay on the Silk Route. So this is really what I wanted to present. I didn't want to make it too long. And I'll end here. I hope that was useful, and I'm waiting, eager for feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Maz. And before I say anything, I would ask the people who listened to these two presentations and would like to make any observations, comments, or maybe ask questions, we'll go ahead with them. Please introduce yourself as to who you are, what your affiliation is, and then go ahead with your observation or question.
I had a comment for Konkona, if I might as well begin.
Oh, well, that would be nice. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
please.
just a suggestion, Konkana, if you're planning to, develop this further, if you looked at Alok Rai's book, Hindi Nationalism, you will also encounter what he calls the MacDonald moment, the acknowledging of Hindi and Urdu as two separate languages. I think that also contributes towards the sort of relegation of the Persian script with regard to Urdu and other Indian languages, Punjabi, etc., gradually over time. And that also hampers eventually the learning of Persian itself. So the change of script also with regard to Hindi from Persian to Nagari also, I think, is a major historical force, if one may call it that, that affects eventually the learning of Persian also, and what you call its amateurization, if you may. So that might be something to look at.
Yes, yes, sure. Thank you for your suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Konkuna has taken the suggestion, and since it was her first presentation, that's the right spirit for a young scholar. And I'm looking forward to the time that you will join our fraternity as a teacher. So that's well taken. Do
Thank
you
you.
have any comments to offer?
Professor Amina, can I make a comment?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
I am Ramakrishnan. I happen to be the president of CLI and very happy to listen to very young scholars who have very good insights in their respective subject. On Kankana, I have just one comment. I agree with what Mas said just now. This question of script was a defining movement. What happens in the late 19th century, this Persianization of Hindustani and the Sanskritization of Hindi, they actually lead to, Alok Rai has written in his very interesting book on this entire controversy. You should look at the book by Alok Rai. He traces the entire history of this division. And this is something which is happening across India. Sanskritization, the standardization of Indian languages, progresses in the wake of the colonial context. And largely the arrival of textbooks and dictionaries, grammars, and there is a gradual print culture coming into Indian languages with periodicals, and prose, and a public sphere. All these are interrelated. That's where you see somebody like Harishchandra, who will also be a very interesting figure to look at in this context. How Hindi is actually being standardized into. You see, it's not only being. You see, this whole question of masculine, feminine actually happens in Khadi Boli Hindi versus what you call the Avathi or Brij Bhasha, and so the new Hindi which is emerging is not the Hindi of the dialects. It is a Sanskritized kind of new language that happened. So there is a parallel kind of thing happening across India. It will be very rewarding if you look at those things. I've written about it partly in some of my essays. And the second presentation that been Bilal, that also raises very interesting points. Your observation that the very title of the conference, when we conceived this whole idea of Persian Arabic poetics, actually the focus was to be Persian Arabic poetics. A whole lot of rethinking went on, and we all wanted it to be discussed in the larger context, of Indian poetics in India. Maybe Indian poetics is a wrong way of putting it. Maybe I would have actually preferred Persian Arabic poetics in the context of poetics in India. And this binary, which you very well mentioned, and the echoes are very much visible in the presentation of Professor Sri Hegde and some of the other presenters. That actually has a history. Maybe this discourse has developed over a period of time. When Sheldon Pollock talks about Sanskrit cosmopolis, he hardly actually, I have critiqued his idea in my book, Indigenous Imaginaries. I have very strongly critiqued. He does not really consider it in the context of the emergence of modern Indian languages. Already, you see, the emergence of modern Indian languages takes place against the background of Persian and Arabic Persian and Sanskrit. So the presence of this heteroglossy, or what you call multilingual kind of interaction for about 900 years. That precisely is the context in which languages from Kannada, Malayalam or Marathi, Gujarati, you see, between 8th century to 15th century, you have this remarkable flowering of Indian languages. So we need to actually examine, re-examine. I have a feeling this is a very important thing. Hegde actually accepted this. I was very happy when he commented, because I had made this point earlier. Sanskrit never translates from any other language. There are hardly 4 or 5 instances where Sanskrit has translated maybe a text, one here, one there. But look at the manner in which Indian languages have continuously, progressively translated major texts, not only from Sanskrit, but from many other languages. This gives, I think, a certain kind of dialogism operating in the constitution of, I wouldn't use the word vernacular modern Indian, you see, that's a totally new kind of cultural, political kind of domain which is emerging. Maybe we need whatever Mas bin Bilal mentioned. It actually is very interesting for me, because the way he actually relates to Benares in the context of 15th, 16th century. This is precisely the time when Enlightenment ideas are entering India. This is precisely the time Benares actually is part of a larger cosmopolitan discourse. So we need to, I have been actually pursuing this, entire area with very few writers have closely looked at the cosmopolitanism which was operating in Indian context in pre-English, pre-colonial period. So I wish your inquiry, Mas, I think it's very exciting, and I look forward to your translation, and I hope you will take it further. It will open up a number of possibilities to re-examine this entire concept. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your comments. I am planning to write an introduction to it as well, which will relate to what I presented today, and hopefully take this further. Thank you so much for your comments.
Welcome. Thank you.
Professor Qazi, may I have a word, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, my name is Anisul Rahman. I have just a few words. I am not going to speak for long. There's no time, I understand. Konkana's paper, I have greatly appreciated, as well as Maz's paper, the presentations, both the presentations. I was just wondering if one can really classify a language as a feminine language or a masculine language, because language operates in many ways. There is a masculinization of language, and a feminization of language, and a politicization of language, and a socialization of language, and a acculturation of language. So there are many, many ways of looking at it. Especially during the past 3 decades, we have been talking of how a language becomes feminine. It's called, and Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and other poets like John Berryman and Theodore Rodiki, and the father of them all, the guide of them all, that was W.T. Snodgrass. So what they're writing, the language that was typically feminine. I wonder if this is a question which could be addressed in very straightforward manner. To Konkan, I greatly appreciate the research that has gone into your paper, but I was also trying to understand if one can appreciate Persian, the kind of Persian that was written when it was an official language. That is one kind of Persian. Then there is another kind of Persian, if you just travel centuries beyond that, and if you reach a poet like Farrukhzad, who is a very major feminist Persian poet coming from Iran. Now, these are two languages. One is a very typically official language, Persian, and the other is a typically feminine language, but with great power. There is so much of a strength in that language. So the whole idea, I have been wondering all these years, while teaching and researching, I have been wondering all these years if language can really be classified into feminine language or social language or cultural language or political language, because language finds its own root. And it finds its own root in the hands of the person who is trying to treat that language and the kind of experience that one is trying to share. So language discovers its own root. I don't see that it can be very clearly classified that this is here, it has been feminized, because tone and tenor matters there. If there is a political discourse, the tone and tenor will define the kind of language it's being used. Similarly, if there is a social piece that's written in Persian or written in Urdu or written in Hindi, that piece will also bear out the social message, and the message commands that language. Because language keeps on, even in one person. If you look at Ghalib Mas, you will see his language also gets transformed from place to place and from time to time. So that was one very small observation, Konkana, and I really greatly appreciate the paper that you have presented, and we greatly hope that you'll be able to make it into a good thesis later. Bhaja's paper was your paper was very well put, and I greatly we have also talked about it earlier. Chirag, there is an important text, Ghalib's text, and I'm look forward to its translation that is coming. I think this year or later this year or early next year. Chirag, there. Apart from that, the confusion that you talked about the topic of the conference that we were discussing, and Professor Ramakrishnan also mentioned that, I'll just add, because there is no dichotomy or contradiction, as you mentioned. What we were trying to do is that we thought that there is if you think of comparative literature and the poetics of the comparative literature, we often think of impact and response. So this whole idea, Ramakrishnan would agree with me, this whole idea started with this, that let's, for this time at least, think of how one literature gets impacted or one language gets impacted. Therefore, the idea of Persian came into mind. And Persian and Sanskrit go hand in hand as far as if we try to look at the Indian literatures, because Persian impacts greatly, especially the South Indian languages, also Urdu and Sanskrit. So this interaction was the idea that we tried to start it with. So how do we interact? How does one literary culture enters into? See, this literary culture and things like, for example, Sanskrit cosmopolis. We are so enamored by foreign scholars. We often quote Sheldon Pollock and say that literary culture was the word used by him for the first time. I don't know, for years we have been using this word in our classrooms. For the past 40 years, I've been using it. But later I was told it was discovered by Sheldon Pollock. Now, this is an irony of our fate. Similarly, cosmopolis, it's a very fashionable word. But we understand simply that you are talking of the Sanskrit universe and how it entails, what it means, what kinds of literary traditions are there. But it's their luck and it's our luck. So they get the credit and we become the followers. So since yesterday, we have at least a dozen times been referring to Sheldon Pollock, Sheldon Pollock, Sheldon Pollock. Well, there are many persons here who have done this. Ramakrishnan has done this. I have done this. You have done this. All of us do it. And in classrooms, 100 times we do this without ever being acknowledged for what we are doing. So my understanding is this, that you shouldn't have any kind of confusion here, because we were simply trying to understand how one literary tradition impacts another literary tradition, because there is a Sanskrit impact on Persian greatly and Persian impact on Sanskrit, and in between we have Urdu. So in Urdu also you have, for example, in recent ghazals I have started saying in Urdu that many of Hindi words are coming and Sanskrit words are coming. For example, in one of my own compositions I wrote, I use the word sanjog. Now, some people just raise their eyebrows and you're writing sanjog. Yes, I did write sanjog, and similar such other words that I've used. So there is no conscious, there is no effort, deliberate effort to do so, and therefore this impact and response is one of the major areas that we talk of when we think of comparative literature. I greatly appreciate both the papers, both the presentations. Look forward to these two younger scholars emerging and taking place of the bigger ones who are now leaving and who are now at the verge of trying to replace with a younger talent. There's so much of huge talent available in our country. Whenever I look at and I silently observe and watch some of the presentations, and I am so full of pride, because I thought that when I was your age, I was never this bright. Thank you, and greatly appreciated both Maz and Konkana. All the very best to you. Thanks, Professor Kazi, for giving me time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. And would there be any others, maybe from our younger colleagues and younger friends, who would like to offer a very quick comment? Because I'm also looking at the time, which is telling me that it is 12:27. We have precisely 3 minutes, because the next session is supposed to start at 12:30. Anyone who would like to offer a very quick comment or clarification?
Yes. May I ask a question, or address myself to Anisur?
Or can I just interrupt? Because I would request you to put your question to the presenters, and this could be a discussion for later on because we are hard pressed for time.
Yes, okay. It is a question. I don't know how Kankana would answer to the question of, to the comment of Anisur Rahman, whether there is a feminist language or not. And I wanted to make my commentary, but of course I would listen first whether she has an answer to that.
Okay, Kankana, if you can just sum it up maybe in a few seconds, your response.
Ma'am, actually, I think, as I have stated also in my paper, actually, as Bakhtin states, the concept of heteroglossia. So there are various strands in the same language. If I'm getting your question right, in that case, yes, obviously, a language can simultaneously be masculine and feminine, as Professor Rahman was also pointing out. So I basically think what I have been trying to point out in my paper is basically the fact that official, that administrative Farsi. I actually I harp upon that masculine and feminine dichotomy as the home and the world dichotomy, the very commonplace dichotomy, so to speak. So I believe that administrative Farsi that was actually in vogue for so many years, centuries together in India, was not that much in vogue, actually losing its place. That's why I call it losing its place, because it is somehow being interiorized. So yes, it is not that Farsi is becoming a feminine language, but that, and also that there have always been feminine strands to Farsi. But the thing is that I might also make another observation, that in the Indian case, as I have read in some places, Farsi was never actually a spoken language. Farsi was the administrative language. So if Farsi is an administrative language, then that language has something of a level of formality attached to it. I don't know about the other places, but for India, as far as I have read, it was exclusively administrative. So at this juncture, when it is becoming interiorized, it's not becoming feminine, but it's kind of becoming feminized, so to speak.
Okay, can I just add to this a little bit? This whole issue of what you have mentioned as feminization of language has to
Yes.
do with not the language being feminized or feminine. It has to do with the usage of that language and the context of usage that gives
Yes.
it the feminine perspective. So let's be
Yes.
clear about that. That a language by itself is not a feminized, entity, right?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah. So
it's just
I don't think we have time for going ahead with questions, though I know that Bokumil wants to get back with a supplementary to this issue. But I just thought this is my way of looking at language. But I just want to quickly sum up by saying that we are all aware, sitting as we are, whichever part of the world that one is in, that Arabic and Persian or Farsi have crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and entered into the Indian peninsula. So it is a kind of a migration of language wherein has occurred a weaving of these two languages into local tongues. And therefore, when I look at the two presentations, I'm very happy, of course, with what Professor Rahman has already said, that it's the younger scholars who will tomorrow be taking the place of senior colleagues. It is to them that we are passing on the baton, and especially in terms of what is the umbrella area of this particular conference, which is looking at the poetics that have come from the other side of the Hindu Kush mountains. I would just say that we should perhaps have said Arabic dash Persian poetics, because then we are looking at the sequence of things rather than the Persian Arabic poetics that occurs as the umbrella topic of our conference. And secondly, I say kudos to both the presenters. Firstly, because they have talked about focused on Persian in terms of the evolution and the relationship that it's had with the cultural milieu of the space into which they have transcended. We have also examined what has been this term, the Malacha aspect of languages in the Indian context. And I do want to finish with just two observations that came to my mind when I was listening to both these young scholars. Uh, the issue of this Malachaism of languages in the Indian context, where something that has connotations of religion makes language also in many cases a religious untouchable, if I may use the word Malecha from that perspective. The second thing which was mentioned very appropriately, that there is a Sanskritization of language where we find that Hindi has come to symbolize a common linguistic code that is sought to be imposed on our sphere of languages. Finally, one has to remember that it was not too far back, it was in 2018, where a writ was filed in a high court to say that words from Persian, which form a part of the Indian Penal Code, should be erased and replaced by other words. So that is where we are headed in terms of not acknowledging the fact that we have a very rich heritage of languages that have been confluences of tongues that have come from outside the peninsula into our space and into our tongues. And with that, I'd like to finish. Sorry for this quick summation and not allowing future questions, because we have the next session on. Congratulations once again to our young friends and to all of the participants. It was wonderful that you joined, and we hopefully will meet again in post-COVID situation where it will be a face-to-face meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope all our senior colleagues will continue to guide us for very long.
That I'll say.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, and thank you all the participants and paper presenters. We are heading towards the next session of our parallel session, and we have Professor Mehjabin Nishat Anzum as the chair. Professor Mehjabin Nishat Anzum is a professor of English in the University of Magad University, Bodh Gaya. She has translated stories of Sadat Hossein Manto into English, which were published in the literary journal Quest. She has translated the Sahitya Academy award-winning novel Disorderly Women by Malthi Rao into Urdu under the title of Bikri Bikri Auratein. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome to the session, and the stage is yours, and please introduce the participants.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. Good afternoon to all of you. And I would like to say that there are 3 presentations in this session. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
So because there is a very poor connectivity of Wi-Fi here at my place, that's why. So there are 3 presentations, and by 3 presenters. Before I start, I invite the presenter, number 1. He is Abdul Sabur Tidwai. Is he present here?
Yeah, yes, ma'am, I'm present here.
So
Good morning.
I would like to introduce you, and it is about you that you hold a master's with distinction from the Aligarh Muslim University, India. His articles are under review at Comparative Literature Studies, Penn State, USA, Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, London, and Indian Literature, Sahit Academy. So I welcome you in this session, and you are invited to present your paper on the topic, Sabke Hindi, Tracing Indian, Parsu and Urdu Phone Poetics. You are welcome to this session.
Thank you, ma'am, for your introduction and for your kind words. Can I just say what a tremendous privilege it is to be here, if only virtually, and to be a part of this international conference. With the chair's kind permission, I would like to briefly talk about the background that informs my paper, which is entitled Sabke Hindi Tracing Indian, Perso, and Urdu Phone Poetics. Primarily, I was interested in exploring what made poetry in Urdu, a language we are told the wholly Indian one, the poetry of India specifically. In other words, I aim at understanding what tradition makes Urdu poetry Indian and which framework it is in which Urdu poets were operating, what ideas they had inherited, and what style they espoused. I would like to begin my paper now, and so, Sabke Hindi Tracing Indian Perso and Urdu Phone Poetics. Persian poetry from the 12th century to the early 19th century can be said to constitute one continuous poetic tradition, a fact that is best exemplified by Saduddin Aini's testimony that the Persian poetry of Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil, who died in 1720, a Chagatai Turk born in Azimabad, present-day Patna, was sung by the illiterate peasants of Transoxiana. So, what was it exactly about this poetic tradition that defied ethnic, linguistic, geographical, and racial boundaries? In spite of the undeservedly bad reputation of Indian-born Persian poets who represent the Sabki Hindi tradition, they hold a prominent place not only in the Persian literary canon, but also in the creation of a truly Indian theory of language and literature. In this paper, I look at the construct of Sabke Hindi, its contemporary understanding, as well as its legacy. I argue that the poetic tradition of the Persian, embodied in South Asian literary imagination, was the cosmopolitan lingua franca of a great swathe of Central, Western, and Southern Asia. Coming to Sabke Hindi itself. So the ill self-treatment of Indian writers of Persian was exacerbated by anxieties of colonial influence, was furthered by nationalist Iranian critics who propagated the Bazgashte Adabi movement, that is the literary renaissance movement, in order to lay sole claim to the inheritance of the Persian literary tradition. This is made all the more evident by the fact that the supposed practitioners of Sabke Hindi never used the terms themselves, and that it was popularized by the Iranian critic Muhammad Taqi Bahar, who died in 1951. Moreover, what came to be called the Indian style was neither invented in India nor did it strike contemporary scholars as being particularly Indian. So while the term Sabke Hindi was initially used pejoratively, it may be treated as an originary point for an wholly Indian poetics, which came to dominate the Urdu and Persian literary landscape of the 18th and 19th centuries. I do not propose to critique the centrality of Persian in India, which is a historiographically overdetermined facet of the debate. Although, in Dudney's words, during the early modern period, India, even compared with Iran, was arguably the world's main center for the patronage of Persian literature and scholarship. However, I do intend to problematize the conception of Sabke Hindi as a purely lingo-geographical category, because contemporary concerns focus more on the interpretation of innovative, that is, Tazago poetry. The label Indian style or Sabke Hindi may be said to describe the poetic modes popular across the Persianate world from the late 16th to the early 19th centuries. However, because Sabke Hindi has a term Hindi in it that refers to a specific place, India, many critics have claimed that the supposed degeneracy of the literature of that period springs from the Indian environment itself. Others claim that the Hindu influence on Persian following Sikandar Lodi's reign from 1489 to 1517 led to the advent of Sabke Hindi. An important distinction, which is often overlooked, is that for much of its existence, Sabke Hindi was used not for the Indian style of Persian poetry, but for the Indian register of the Persian language. However, this distinction is in the main relates to the contemporary critics of Sabke Hindi, such as Wali Dagestani and Hazin, who died in the mid 18th century. Whereas Sabke Hindi has come to mean an Indian style of poetry, Indian poetics, or perhaps most correctly, Indo-Persian poetics. However, it is passing strange that much ado has been made about a phenomenon of which no study has attempted to understand the theory and practice of language by poets of the Indian style themselves. To the contrary, and I quote, the Indian Persianist Muhammad Abdul Ghani, writing at roughly the same time as Muhammad Taqi Bahar was popularizing his chronology for Persian literature and the label Sabke Hindi, argues that there would be no need for such a study of the Sabke Hindi tradition, because the Indian style was essentially Persian and was founded on the same model as obtained in or was brought in from Persia. Yet, the writers in Persia had called Indian Persian Sabke Hindi, which gave an impression that Indian Persian was somehow different and could not be considered equal to the Persian of Iran. Here, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi's disclaimer is worth bearing in mind that the silence of earlier dictionaries of classical Persian on the term Sabke Hindi raises the suspicion that the concept of differentiated authorial styles, or even style in general, as exemplified by individual writers or specific schools or circles of literary creation, is foreign to the Indo-Persian literary culture, and our awareness of the problem of an Indian style of the Persian ghazal is more of a modern construct than a living reality of that tradition. A synchronic approach to the Sabke Hindi question reveals that there was much interest in the Indian literary scene with regard to the legitimacy of the debate between what could be called original Persian or Indianized Persian. This is made most famous by the feud between Sirajuddin Khan Arzu, who died in 1756, and Hazin, and the literary antagonism that was distant by over a century between Khan Arzu and Munir, who died in 1644. In response to both of these critics, Khan Arzu had raised a very valid point. He implied that the Cree group is that of the masters of the language, that is, Arbab Sukhan or even Ahl Tahqiq or Sanad, rather than Ahl Zaban. The operative distinction here is not whether one has spoken a language from childhood or not, a native speaker in our conception, but rather whether one belongs either by birth or later association to a community associated with that language. Participants in the Persian literary sphere were aware of the fact that they fit not only into a network of people but also of texts and social practices. The textual canon was cosmopolitan, a development which Arzu historicizes. It was thus possible to dispute the felicity of Iranians in using their own language, since training is required to master the canon. Arzu drew the distinction between merely knowing a language and being trained in literary production. And I have quoted this from Dudley. Similarly, when it comes to the belief that ethnic markers were more reflective of a group's belonging than their circumstances of birth, we can see that Aurangzeb specifically referred to Iranians whether they were born in Vilayat or in Hindustan. So that lends credence to this belief. Education and mastery over language were guarantors of acceptability within the Persianate canon, and the group of poets later identified as practitioners of Sabke Hindi were considered authentic enough to allow them to introduce innovations into this language, a right that is usually reserved for those considered Ahl Zaban or native speakers. In the absence of central regulatory authority for the language, Arzu argued for the practice of sanad, that is, linguistic and grammatical precedent set by acknowledged masters of Persian, and this was the ordering principle for literary scholarship or tahqiq. However, the established convention of reliance on sanad was threatened by people's enjoyment and approval of verse that did not have an obvious precursor. And this is where the crux of that tension lies, and that tension which prompted the Sabke Hindi debate. Could the Indo-Persian tradition be allowed enough autonomy and independence to pioneer a course for itself? Arzu certainly seemed to believe so, and this cemented his enduring status as a proponent of Sabke Hindi, and indeed a truly Indian Persian poetics, which would go on to shape Urdu as well. He most directly addresses tensions between Iranians and Indian Persianists when he writes that the objection of Iranians against Indians' idiomatic usage, that is Rozmarra, are unfounded. Mastery, however, is crucial. He notes that a certain expression has become standard in Indo-Persian through strength and not because of weakness and error. Azruye khudrat ast, na azrahe ijzu dalil. I would also like to look at the figures of Bedil and Ghalib, and perhaps the most infamous poet identified with Sabke Hindi was Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil, who was born in Azimabad to an uneducated Turk family. In spite of his humble roots, he became a noted poet, adding depths of cerebral, philosophical, and psychological insights to poetry. Interestingly, it was the same distinction of infusing the human experience into poetry that heralded the advent of Jadid or modern Urdu poetry and established Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib as the first modern Urdu poet. In this regard, Bedil, more than any other practitioner of Sabke Hindi, can be understood as the preceptor of an Indian poetics. Both Narang and Farooqi say that Sabke Hindi, the Indian style of Mughal Persian poetry with indigenized poetics, evolved into the Urdu ghazal's immediate ancestor. And it was Bedil who can be considered to be at the forefront of this style, the Sabke Hindi style. Yet his complexity of thought and range of emotion did not spare him contemporary criticism and later neglect, if not outright ignominy. In fact, it can be said that most of the criticism of Indian style poets' use of Persian emanates from Bedil's disreputation as an undisciplined writer. However, much as he is maligned, recent opinion has been kinder, with Gopichan Narang writing that Bedil is the founder of a new school of Persian poetry. There is no doubt that we can call his work the high point of Sabke Hindi. He was blessed by nature with an extraordinary ability to express his intricate thoughts. His poetic work is a treasure of various strains of philosophy, priceless similes, and metaphors. It does seem that Bedil was keeping in line with the poetics of his day, for his emphasis lay on the established convention of Tazagoi, that is freshness of speech. For he writes, Shayari ibarat az maniya taza yabist. Poetry is that which creates fresh meaning. And this endowed him with the sobriquet of Abul Mani, or Master of Meaning. To reiterate, unlike Sabki Hindi, Taza Goi, also known as Tarz Taza or Ibarat Taza, both of which mean fresh style or fresh expression, was a contemporary label used by both the adherents and detractors in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a constant attempt to introduce new themes and thoughts, what Farooqi terms Mazmoon Afrini and Mani Afrini. Contemporary reception for poets who are Maniyab, that is, seekers and finders of new themes, and Tazago, or composers of fresh and new style poetry, was mainly of widespread delight. In this light, it may seem puzzling for Bedil to have met with such treatment as to be derided not only by Iranian nationalists who could not reconcile with his Indian birth and Turk heritage, but also by Mir Taqi Mir, who dismisses him as a Rekhta master poet. While critique for Iran can be explained away as a sort of literary chauvinistic nationalism, or even Urfi Shiazi could not escape the disdain reserved for the Sabki Hindi poets. Others summed up Urfi's Diwan in the following words. And Sheri Khali as Fasahat Nabud, a few couplets which are not devoid of excellence. But the Indian response, as exemplified by Mir, must be understood in the context of colonial influence chipping away at the Indian belief in composing in Persian. So informing all of this contention and debate was the crisis of authority in this period, which sprang from the maturation of a poetics that explicitly valued newness or taza goi. Contemporary reception to these poet philologists remained lukewarm at best or hostile at worst. Bedil, despite being the foremost Indo-Persian poet, is remembered only as a Rekhta master poet, and Arzu was not an Urdu poet, nor did people of that time consider Urdu poetry to be an accomplishment. And these words are from Maulvi Hussain Azad in his Ab Hayat. But even Mir asserts that Hama Ustadan Mazboot Fan Rekhta Ham Shagirdan and Buzurgwar. That is, all masters of Rekhta were tutored under him. So while this crisis of authority spurred Azu into a lexicographical and philological enterprise, which made him the founder of the language known as Urdu, his work preceding Insha and Qatil's 1807 Darya Latafat by more than half a century, Bedil had advanced in another, more creative sort of direction. He became the leading light of the Sabki Hindi tradition and laid the foundation for Urdu poetry. This is important in two regards. For A, it establishes Bedil within the literary Indo-Persian canon, and B, places him as the direct spiritual Ustad of Ghalib, the founder of Jadid Urdu poetry, thereby forming a continuous link between Sabki Hindi and modern Urdu poetry. Bedil produced texts that are at once a theory of language and a theory of poetry, allowing us glimpses into subtle arguments and delightful nuances of literary language. And though they were separated by a distance of 2 centuries, his theories of language and poetry provided him with his most illustrious rival, Ghalib. Ghalib was perhaps the most prominent of Urdu poets, although by his time the debate on Sabki Hindi had cooled and Indian Persian writers lacked the confidence to consider themselves equal to Iranian writers. Yet his pride of place in the domain of the Urdu ghazal sets him up as the inheritor of the Sabki Hindi tradition. Indeed, we find what was just a spark in Sabki Hindi poetry, it became a full-fledged fire in Ghalib's work. If we want to reach the soul of Sabki Hindi, we have to go through Bedil, and no discussion of the greatness of Ghalib's philosophical orientation and his creative genius is complete unless we keep in view Bedil's mystique. And these words are from Gopi Chandran. As we all know, Ghalib preferred his Persian verses to his Urdu poetry and saw himself as next only to Amir Khusro in terms of his felicity in Persian. He even wrote, Ghalib as Araq-ma Naqsh Zuhuri Damid, Surmaya Hayrat Kashin Dida Badidan Dahim. Ghalib, the color of Zuhuri shines from my pages. Let us apply the antimony of wonderment to our eyes and look. In spite of all his pretensions to Iranian heritage and his elevation of Persian to the extent that he says, Anche dar guftar fakhr tust an nang man ast, as in the poetry for which you are so proud, which obviously refers to Urdu poetry, that is a matter of shame for me. It is indeed remarkable that Ghalib did not build a follower relationship with non-Indian poets like Hafiz, Sadi, Firdausi, Jami, or Nizami, as he did with Bedil, though the Iranian poets were considered great at that time. As an, if not the heir of Bedil, Ghalib had an arduous task ahead of him. However, judging from Hali's summation of Ghalib's Turfagi Khayal and Jiddatun Udatte Mazamin, that is, his freshness of ideas and his newness of themes, he has done justice to that man. Ghalib also acknowledges his debt to Bedil, and he referred to himself as Faqir Bedil. If he considered anyone as his true mentor and a guiding spirit, that was Bedil. He profusely praised Tarz Bedil and said that it was the gift of Bedil's verse that his own work showed messianic characteristics. These couplets contained a loving admission of the influence of the Song of Bedil, that is Naum-e Bedil, his distinctive flourish, and his spring-like creativity. Bahar Ijadi-e Bedil. He called the verse of Bedil a great spiritual guide or his khazr. So while the roles of Bedil, Arzu, and Ghalib have been discussed above, encompassing the age of transition from Persian hegemony to the nascent and developing Urdu schema respectively, the Aligarh Tehreek of the 1870s sought to establish a new chapter not only in the poetic tradition, but also in the linguo-cultural imagination of this speech community. And this is to the fore not only in Sayyid Ahmad Khan's vociferous attempts to simplify Urdu language and literature, but also in the works of Khaja Altaf Hussain Hali, who was the poet laureate of the Aligarh movement. Sayyid Ahmad Khan's interaction with Ghalib in 1855 must have been instructive and perhaps was the germ of the idea that later became the Aligarh movement. Sayyid Ahmad Khan instilled an organized, collective, and social feeling that is characteristic of Hali and Shibli's poetry. Owing to his overarching influence, in his Muqaddamah Sher Shairi, Hali asked the poet to write on social issues and to come out of the imaginary world that did not exist. In the opening session of the first Mushaira held under the auspices of this endowment in Lahore in 1874, Azad appealed to the poets to come out of the grooves of responses conditioned by Persian culture and to root their thoughts into the ethos of the land. So Sayyid Ahmad's attempt to recalibrate Urdu for scientific learning by way of establishing his scientific society as well as his reorientation of the direction of Urdu literature are well-documented phenomena. Most significant in the field of reorienting Urdu literature, however, was Hali's Muqaddamah Sher Shairi, which drew inspiration from the British Romantic movement and pushed for a poetics which was closer and truer to nature in order to bring Urdu literature up to European or scientific standards. It also reconfigured Urdu poetry to weigh in on materialism and set the stage for a modern literary criticism as typified in Hali's Muqaddamah and Shibli's later Sher al-Ajam. Ali's Muqaddamah developed the rejection of the classical poetic praxis, and it is often cited as one of the first modern works of Urdu criticism. Even as Sayyid Ahmad's word to Hali delineate that this begins the modern age of poetry, it is beyond me to describe its elegance and beauty and its flowing quality. I am amazed at this factual theme, which is devoid of lies, exaggeration, and far-fetched similes. Things that poets take pride in has been expressed by you in such an effective and eloquent manner. So what I argue, and I conclude my paper here, is that these figures of Bedil, Khan Arzu, Ghalib, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, they form a continuous link in terms of representing Sabke Hindi by way of embodying an Indian poetics. So each of these individuals faced opprobrium, contemporary criticism, and widespread opposition. Yet, these four individuals of the 17th, 18th, and the two very different halves of the 19th century are indicative of the transition from a Persian-speaking elite of Central Asian descent to the Urdu-speaking, almost wholly Indian community, with reference to the poetics and literary imaginations of the people who shaped the generic discourse of these languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a nice presentation. And our next speaker is Asit Kumar Biswal. Are you present?
Yes, ma'am.
Before I invite you for your presentation, I'll just like to give a brief introduction. You are currently pursuing your MA in Comparative Literature at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. You have a bachelor degree in English literature. You enjoy wandering in and about literature, trying to understand himself and others. So now you are invited to present your paper on the topic, The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of About the Taj Mahal, the Poetics and Aesthetics of Dialogue in Select Taj Mahal Nazms. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. What I will do in this paper is first I'll try to look at these ideas in the discipline of comparative literature and then try to do readings of some of the poems that I have mentioned. This paper is also kind of an attempt to learn for myself and understand what it means to engage in the comparative study of literature. So if there are any lapses, I hope you will excuse it as the novice of, as the misgivings of a novice. Before I begin my paper, I would like to read two quotes. The first one is by Borges. He says in this craft of verse, I have found that I only have faltering kind of greed. This creed may perhaps be useful to me, but hardly to others. I suppose there should be as many creeds, as many religions as there are poets. Then Simone de Beauvoir says in her essay, What Can Literature Do? In any case, for me, the reader, what is important is to be fascinated by a singular world that intersects with mine and yet is other. The title of my paper is The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation about the Taj Mahal, the Poetics and Aesthetics of Dialogue in Select Taj Mahal Nazms. As you might have noticed, the title of this paper echoes that of Michael Oakeshott's essay, The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind, in which he posits the idea that the ideal image for the human intercourse is that of a conversation, in which different voices or modes of utterances meet. This image, I feel, is apt for the practice of comparative literature, which is predicated upon difference and plurality. That is the coexistence of multiple and different entities and as a result, multiple voices and perspectives. Oakeshott writes, in the conversation, the participants are not engaged in an inquiry or debate. There is no truth to be discovered, no proposition to be proved, no conclusion sought. They are concerned not to inform, to persuade, or to refute one another. Therefore, the coherency of their utterances does not depend on all of them speaking in the same idiom. They may differ without disagreeing. There is no symposiarch or arbiter, nor even a doorkeeper to examine credentials. It is an unrehearsed intellectual adventure. This intellectual adventure is what Merleau-Ponty, in other words, says that uh, the intersubjective space between the self and the other is uncharted territory. It is like a mysterious adventure which we have to plunge ourselves into. It is conversation as with gambling. Its significance lies neither in winning nor in losing, but in wagering. Properly speaking, it is impossible in the absence of a diversity of voices. In it, different universes of discourse meet, acknowledge each other, and enjoy an oblique relationship which neither requires nor forecasts their being assimilated into one another. This passage articulates some of the key ideas we take into account in the practice of comparative literature and the comparative approach to life. The idea of difference is central to comparative literature. Difference is an existential condition arising out of our being in the world. We live in relation to others, we do not live in isolation. And the essential feature of every other is their uniqueness or singularity. Or we can say the only universality is the singularity of every being. Our perspective by definition is subjective and limited, and in order to form a complete perspective, we have to take into account others' perspective as well. In order to do so, we have to engage in conversation with others, engage in dialogue with the other. The dialogue with the self and the other, between identity and difference, is central to comparative literature. Comparative literature, as I see it, is simply put a way of reading literature. Emphasis on reading as the verb, it is something that is to be done. It's not a theory. It is an approach or a method for the study of literature. When we say comparative, the idea of comparison is not to be taken literally. The idea of comparison entails more than one entity, and one of the entities is the reading or writing self in the case of literature. Comparison has to do with how the self relates to the other, what kind of relation is established between the self and the other. Needless to say, the other is an other because it is irreducibly different from the self. Hence, the comparative method simply refers to our approach to dealing with difference, an answer to the question, how to live with difference. In the human conversation, each voice, which is unique and different, has its own singular place and is not inherently superior or inferior to one another by any given standard. In this paper, I'll be looking at how this conversation takes place in literature in the form of a dialogue between the self and the other in lyric poetry. I'll be reading select nazms written about the Taj Mahal for this purpose, and looking at this dialogue, try to understand how, even if it is about the same object, it can happen in multiple ways, emphasizing the plurality of perspective through which difference is presented. In other words, the poem shares an identity in terms of the object of aesthetic mediation or imitation, and yet are different and singular in terms of presentation of the aesthetic object through language. Many poets have written about Taj Mahal. I will be looking at the poems written by Sahil Ludhianvi, Kafi Azmi, Mahsar Badaimi, and Parvin Sakir, each of which is interestingly titled Taj Mahal. Before we get to the poems, let me briefly recount the view of literature on the basis of which I will be reading the poems. A literary text is one which uses the extra-conceptual resources of language to elicit an aesthetic response from the reader, generally pleasure or delight, to achieve defamiliarization in the reader and provide them with what the Indian philosopher Syed Abdul Said calls reflective understanding. The pleasure here is, as Said puts it, of looking at things through the semi-transparency of language. Borrowing from Said again, literary discourse aims at expressing the being of things by penetrating the haze of generality, the curtain of conceptuality that is characteristic of language. The delight of literature, of art, is the delight of glimpsing the being of things in their uniqueness, or each form. This is achieved by neutralizing the iterability of science. This gesture of counter-iterativity, which makes literature a non-iterable sign, is key to literariness. A literary reading entails reading literature as literature, not as history or philosophy or science or anything else. From a comparative perspective, we do not locate literariness in the text alone. It is the relation between the text and the reader, or the self and the other. The text may have qualities in it that can facilitate a literary reading, but unless a reader reads it from a literary perspective, literature does not come into being. This dialogue between the reader and the text leads to the event of literature in the act of reading. It is this fusion of horizons between the reader and the text, where both participate in meaning making, that literature happens. So what I'm trying to posit here is, instead of a canonical or author-centric view of literature, we are trying to look at it from a relational or experiential point of view. Like Buber points out, the author receives his creative force in fifth from his partner in dialogue. Where there is no genuine dialogue, there will be no poetry. Oxford makes a distinction between the different voices which participate in the conversation of mankind, as he calls it, the most prominent of which are the voices of practical activity, science, and poetry. The self-hissage is an activity. It is not a static self, as theories of identity would have us believe. The self-hissage is an act of imagining. The self makes and recognizes images, moves about them in manners appropriate to their characters, thus sensing, perceiving, feeling, desiring, believing, contemplating, supposing, knowing, preferring, and so on. Each have its place, an identifiable mode of imagining and moving about in appropriate manner among images of a certain kind. The other, or the not self as he calls it, is composed of images. This activity of imagining self and the image of the other are not given. They are not fixed. He says, is concerned with contemplating and delighting. Poetry, he says, and I quote, poetry appears when imagining is contemplating imagining. That is, when images are not recognized either as fact or non-fact, where they do not either provoke moral approval or disapproval, where they are not causes, effects, or means to ulterior ends. They are simply made, remade, observed, turned out, played with, meditated upon, and delighted in. And when they are composed into larger patterns, which are themselves only more complex illusions. As he rightly points out, there is no given or overarching teleology for literature. It has what can be called a purposeless purpose. Literature moves us through a special use of language, and apart from this ecstatic emotive appeal, we can hardly attribute any other end or telos to it. It may perform other functions, but they are not its primary concern. And even when these functions are aimed at, they are done through this emotive appeal. When you look at the poems, they are not concerned with desiring or obtaining any particular end, as in the case of practical activity, nor are they concerned with inquiring about the nature of the object, that is the Taj Mahal, as science would do. What they do instead is to present to the reader how the image of the Taj Mahal is perceived and made, remade, observed, turned out, played with, and meditated upon and presented through different perspectives using language. Al-Farabi also points out that poetry is not syllogistic. It does not work through reasoning. According to him, poetry comes into being when what is intelligible in soul is affirmed in speech, which means that when what is imagined gets expressed in language, poetry comes into being. He goes on to say that all poetic statements are false, which means that the concern of poetry is not truth. Poetry does not make any truth claim. It is concerned with wisdom, or we can call it understanding. According to him, there are two kinds of discourses. One is akli and the other is takhili. The former pertains to the brain and is concerned with reason, while the latter pertains to khayal or imagination. Poetry is not related to imagination. It is related to fantasia, which is something that does not exist and is hence imaginative. Poetry is also concerned with the ability to move the reader. Poetic statements are image-invoking statements which create an image in the mind of the reader. These nouns are not concerned with the actual Taj Mahal, but present a certain perception of it to the reader. All four nazms are lyric poems. The mode of enunciation is in the first person. When the speaker speaks in this mode, as Paul Liman points out, anything that is presented in the poem is regulated by the trope of anthropomorphism in lyric. Everything is spoken using human terms, even if the speaker is a non-human. The non-human speaker's experiences are anthropomorphized. In all the four nazms, the speaker is human and is responding to the non-human other, the Taj Mahal, and the effect it has on them. Sahib's and Kafir's nazms are explicitly addressed to a human other, which we can also read as the beloved of the speaker. This dialogue between the lyrical self and the other result in the singular utterance that is the poem. Let us now take a quick look at the Nazms. Mahsar Badayani's Nazm Taj Mahal was one of the earliest Nazms written on the Taj Mahal. If we read these Nazms at different voices in the poetic conversation about the Taj Mahal, then Badayani's Nazm is, in a way, begins the conversation. It exemplifies the poetic presentation of the view that the Taj Mahal is an embodiment of love and beauty that can be said to be dominant in the structure of feeling of the time it was written. The prevalent ideas about the Taj Mahal make up the raw stuff out of which the stuff of the Nazm is constructed in language. The lyrical eye or speaker of the poem is in an ecstatic frame of mind and is utterly impressed by the majestic beauty of the monument. The Nazm consists of 20 rhyming couplets, the first of which is अल्लाह मैं ये ताजमहल देख रहा हूँ या पहलू जमुना में कमल देख रहा हूँ, which shows the speaker's amazement at the sight of the other, here the Taj Mahal. It is as if he is explaining to himself in his ecstasy, and each act of exclamation brings out a whole array of vivid images and metaphors, which you find in all of the 20 couplets. For example, फिरदौस से नजर गुलदस्ता रंगीन काफे साहिल पर धरा है, बिल्लोर का सागर है कि सहवा से भरा है, बातें मस्त ये ताज करने से अभी रात के जमी पर सोया है कोई बादशाह है वक्त यहीं पर, Jannate Daricha and so on, which go on to describe the singularity of the Taj Mahal. This also relates to Ibn Rushd's idea that for poetic pronouncements you do not require the assent of the other person. It is the speaker who is making the pronouncements and that is all. The other person need not even be present or aware of it for it to be considered poetic. The final couplet goes, नजरों में अभी तक वही दिलचस्प समा है, आंखों में मेरी ख्वाबगाह है साजहां है. The speaker finds the image of the Taj Mahal so enchanting that he feels he can relate to the vision or the dream that Shahjahan had in having it constructed. When it comes to Sahir's Nazm, it can be read as a voice responding to the speaker in the previous one. When Sahir was writing, the Progressive Writers Association, whose members had several Urdu poets of the time, including Sahir, had a significant impact on the literary structure of feeling of the time, and the association's agenda to employ literature to pursue the goals of social reform, equality, justice, and anti-colonial movements. In such a situation, the perception of the Taj Mahal is markedly different from the previous Nazm. The speaker here is addressing the other, his beloved, about Taj Mahal. The beloved seems to be one who sees the Taj Mahal in terms similar to the speaker in Badayani's Nazm. As you can see from the lines, ताज तेरे लिए एक मजहर उल्फत ही सही, तुझको इस वादी रंगीन से अकीदत ही सही. The speaker is then responding to the beloved's perception of the Taj Mahal. This Nazm can be read as a twofold response to the other. The speaker's response to his beloved, as well as the poem as a response to Badayani's Nazm. The speaker does not think highly of the Taj Mahal despite its popularity. He feels that the wealth and royalty that this Taj stands for negates the sincere loves and lives of the ordinary people as well as their struggles and exploitation. He says, सब जिस राह में हो सतवते शाही के निशां, उस पे उल्फत भरी रूहों के सफ़र क्या मानी, ये चमनजार ये जमुना का किनारा ये महल ये मुनक्कस दरो दीवार ये मेहराब ये ताक, एक शहंशाह ने दौलत का सहारा लेकर हम गरीबों की मोहब्बत का उड़ाया है मजाक, मेरी महबूब कहीं और मिला मकर मुझे. All the grand and majestic architectural structures that comprise the Taj Mahal are an insult and riddle to the loves of the poor by an emperor who happened to have more wealth and could vulgarly show off his love. Kafi Azmi's poem had a similar take on the Taj but with a subtle difference. Here too the speaker is addressing another, a friend about the Taj Mahal. The speaker however acknowledges the beauty of the Taj Mahal unlike the speaker in Sahir's Nazm. मरमरी मरमरी फूलों से उबलता हीरा, चांद की आंच में दागते हुए सीमी मीनार, जहने शायर से ये करता हुआ चश्मक पे हम, एक मल्लिका का जिया पोसो फजताब मजार. But instead of being enchanted by this beauty, the speaker is disenchanted, unlike the speaker in Badayani's Nazm, and wants to go back. This beauty makes him think of those who lie on the street like corpses. Taj is an embodiment of ridicule and discrimination towards the masses for him, which is masked behind the veil of love. He wants nothing to do with the admiration and worship of this beautiful monument, which is nothing but a grave. Parveen Shakir's Nazm adds a different dimension to this conversation. In this poem, the speaker humanizes the Taj Mahal and attributes human emotions to it. The Taj acts as a continuum between the past and the present. The stony structure is seen to grant eternity to love. The cool arms of the marble that the Taj has sealed the sleeping beauty inside. The Taj Mahal stands for such a strange sleep and eternal dream, whose dreamers are long gone. But it still makes those who come in contact with it try to interpret it, and this is so enchanting that they lose sleep in the process. क्या अजीब नींद है जिसको छू कर जो भी आता है खुली आंख लिए आता है, सोचो के ख्वाब अबद देखने वाले कब के, और जमाना है कि उस ख्वाब की ताबीर के लिए जाग रहा है अब तक. Taj the other elicits such a response from the speaking self. It is very similar to the poetic process itself. The poet creates the poem and dies to to use a Barthesian term. And each time a reader reads it, the experience is presented in the poem comes alive in a new way and gives what Simone de Beauvoir calls the taste of another life. For Ibn Sina, the wonderment derived from the poetic text is takhili. It pertains to the imagination. This wonder is not achieved through likeness or veridical relations to the objects, but through an ontological distance between the image and the original. Poetry aims at imaginative representation, not a statement of opinions or facts, as is the case with practical activity and science. The peculiar character of this imitation makes pleasure aesthetic. Cognitive and logical functions of language consider matter being conveyed, while poetry is considered with the utterance itself. As we saw, the Nazms are not concerned with the actual Taj Mahal and reporting it through language. They are concerned with the imaginative representation and not with the actual Taj. To conclude again with Oxford, poetic imagining brings to the conversation a unique utterance, not to be assimilated by other. That is, there is no hierarchy between them. Its voice is preeminently conversible. The relationship between the poetic images is itself a conversational relationship. They neither confirm nor refute one another. They merely evoke one another and join, not to compose a premeditated conclusion. That is, they do not have any teleology, but to compose another and more complex image of the same kind. As you can see, in the different ways in which the Taj Mahal is perceived in these different points. To listen to the voice of poetry is to enjoy not a victory but a momentary release, a brief obliquely, it is to enjoy something more. This more could be an understanding about our existence or the mystery of our relation with the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Asif Kumar Biswal, for your presentation. Before I invite the next speaker, I would like to say that this is the last presentation which Brinda Das Gupta is going to do. And after this, the house will be open for observations and comments by the participants, and then I will submit my own observation. So now I invite Brinda Das Gupta just to introduce her. Is she there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Okay. So before you start, I would like to introduce you to the other participants. She is presently an independent scholar. Her research interests are indigenous and diaspora studies, theater studies, queer and feminist literary criticism, and modern Indian literary components in South Asia. She is presently pursuing a course on translation studies from the Center for Translations of Indian Jadavpur University with Sahitya Academy. So now you are invited to do your presentation. And before you start, I would like to submit my own this thing that all three of you are the scholars, young scholars, and I'm really happy to say and share my feelings that when at this stage you are presenting papers, tomorrow you will be really giving some new ideas in research and especially in languages and these areas where we are going to have a discussion. Thank you. Now you are invited to present your paper.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, but a little, your voice is breaking. Should I put off my microphone?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, maybe.
Actually, there is some problem with my video here. It has just erupted. So I'm not able to open my video. So bear with me without seeing me.
Thank you, ma'am. I shall not switch on my video either. The title of my paper is The Reception of Persian Sufi Poetic Concepts in Bengal, taking a look at Tagore's verses and songs. India, the Indian and the Persian lands happen to have certain commonalities of social, cultural, philosophical, and mystical pursuits for centuries. This commonality has its roots in the shared lives of the two given spaces, which are commonly perceived as places that largely deal with spiritual endeavors and philosophical reflection. The interactions between the Bhakti and Sufi traditions paved way for cultural transactions and obliterated the imposed impossibility to communicate with regard to spiritual ideas and culminated into the production of the literary works relevant to the date. It has often happened that poets such as Rumi and Rabindranath have been placed within the same bracket for their philosophical perspective and the essentially humanistic approach. In this paper, I shall make a humble attempt to trace poet-cultural contact and the shared attributes that figured in their literary works. It is imperative that we remember that Rabindranath's coming of age was largely dependent upon the professional patronage of Rabindranath Tagore, his father. Rabindranath recalls, "My father was a great scholar. He was intoxicated with Hafiz's verses. When I was a boy, I used to listen to his recitation of those poems, and he translated them to me with a fervor of enjoyment that touched my heart. It brings to my mind once again how my father, to the end of his days, derived deep consolation from poet songs as imitating them in his devotional life." The passage that I just quoted explains his proclivity to Persian poetry. Furthermore, in Reminiscence, the Tagore marks, in those days, the fashions in food and dress of our recent Mohammedan conquerors had not become obsolete. The outdoor costume of men consisted of the Musalman type of achkan and jibba. In this context, one must also note that famously, the Tagores were known as the Pir Ali Brahmins, who willingly allude to receiving from the Persian Sufi tradition of the family. As I have mentioned already, the constant presence of the verses of Hafiz in Tagore's childhood had a substantial impact on him and the way his spiritual belief shaped up. If we consider the works of Hafiz alongside taking a close look at Tagore's works, the explicitly monotheistic outlook can be seen as the reception of the same. The central point that both aim to drive home is that God and us are not separate entities. Rabindranath, after his journey to Iran, wrote a travelogue entitled Baroshe in Persia. According to Shrivata Bose, the travelogue is not merely a diary or any other travelogue, but a significant, meticulous observer of cultures. I quote, "It is the closest thing to a real history among Tagore's writings based not just on his philosophical musings, but on really solid empirical research." Now, I would like to mention that Rabindranath commented on his journey to Persia in 19. This quote will be slightly long, I hope you bear with me. "Persians have a passion for poetry, a genuine affection for their poets, and I have obtained a share of this affection without having to show anything for it in return. So this is the foundation of my poetry. And on top of that, the rumor has gone forth that my poems have an affinity with those of their favorite mystic poets. Once I got acquainted with Iran from distance in my childhood days. The image of Iran was a land of poets, reflections, and of imaginations. Its language was Persian, and the message was altogether for the whole of humanity. My father was a passionate fan of Hafiz. He used to recite the couplets of Hafiz and explain it to me. The image of Iran was drawn through these verses on the canvas of my mind. Sitting at the tomb of Hafiz, suddenly I realized a flash of light releasing from the gleeful eyes of the poet of Shiraz, having traveled through many ages, reflected upon my heart. Now, moving on to how direct or indirect influences might have worked on Rabindranath, we will look at how he resonates Rumi and how the common notion of love in them becomes palpable. I quote from Rabindranath: "Yes, I know this is nothing but thy love. O beloved of my heart, this golden light that dances upon the leaves, these idle clouds sailing across the sky, this passing breeze leaving its coolness upon my forehead, it has flooded my eyes. This is thy message to my heart. Thy face is bent from above. Thy eyes look down on my eyes, and my heart has touched thy feet." Let us now take a look at how this theme has been explored by Ruby. I quote: "It is the love that simmers the sea like boiler. It is the love that grinds the mountain unto sand. It is the love that tears sky into 100 parts. It is the love that tremors the earth with its extravagance. Whose ever garment is torn in someone's love, he gets purified from greed, lust, and all ills. Be happy, O the jubilant love mania." Despite the temporal gap, mysticism is what binds these two poets together, often bringing them within the same bracket. In this context, it would be essential to remember that Rabindranath also largely Baul tradition, which revolves around mysticism. Regarding the notion of love as found in the verses of Rabindranath, he said that he doesn't see life separately from love, and love is what serves as the driving force for him. He says, my life is derived from love. This world is mortal, but the love is everlasting. Everything will perish except love, which will ever remain in its original shape to train human soul to reach his goal. The articulations of Ruby are not merely restricted to his time and space, but always aims to transcend all the superimposed obstacles to exude the aura of love. The notion of non-duality has figured in at every point. According to Rumi, the divine lies at the core of our existence, and the engulfing presence of the omnipresent, omniscient, bound by love, as reflected in their verses. Rabindranath has always recognized a great power in his writings, revolving around the concept of Jiban Devata, the one who guides. This is often signified by his frequent use of the word "to me," as evidenced in some of his seminal songs. In this context, it will not be an excess to mention that another frequently observed motive is the acquaintance with the simple joy of living, which is ananda, which we can also observe as a parallel in this discussion. The reception of the Persian Arabic tradition in Rabindranath becomes explicit with the use of the mystic pursuits based commonly on attributes such as unity of being, exploring the inner self, and most definitely a direct communication with God, bringing God closer than pushing God away. In conclusion, I would like to say that Rabindranath and the Persian Sufi poets in discussion have lived. Ma'am, do I have time? Ma'am?
Sorry, we are running short of time in the sense that there should be time for the observations
Okay,
and
I'll just conclude. Yeah, yeah.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
so, Rabindranath and the Persian Sufi poets in discussion live through different types expressed in different languages. However, spoke about the central language of love. Rabindranath has been heralded as a poet and a creator with who defies national borders. His works are a testament to deep attachment to his Indian roots, often featuring profound political statements which are at odds with his oracle-like reputation across the world. A major part of his writings was created in the post-war period when Europe was experiencing the era of high modernism and estrangement, and the death of God were prevalent themes in literature. There was a complete abandonment of art and ethical communication, and the worthy purpose that Wordsworth had spoken about was falling apart. I'm sorry. It is this backdrop that makes the works of Rabindranath stand out in their message of hope, optimism, love, and the simple joys of life. As a parent, Tagore was deeply influenced by the Sufi poets. Tagore's reception of Persian Sufi poets contributed in the shaping up of the spiritual milieu with respect to Persian culture through his verses and songs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Now all the three presentations are over and the house is open for observation and comments by the participants, of course. Hello, are you hearing? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Yes, yes, yes. Now I feel reassured that I am audible.
Participants can unmute themselves and answer certain issues that ma'am want to be pointed out.
Sorry?
Ma'am, I am just saying participants can unmute themselves and engaging a talk with you.
I'm not inviting the participants in the sense, but the house, the other scholars who are attending this session. It is for them.
Okay,
Yes?
okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
They can submit their observations and comments. Then after that, I'll submit my own observation. So I'm inviting them from the house. Any question, any query on the papers which have been presented by these young scholars? Anyways, I don't find anyone coming forward with the question or observation. So I would like to put my own observation. There were three papers which were presented in this session. Is there somebody who wants to say something?
Ipshita ma'am is trying to say something, I think.
Okay, it's all right. That is a welcome.
No, not really. The thing is that, I mean, I was hoping that other people would say something because a lot of people are here.
Thank you so much, Ishpita. you came forward. That is really appreciating. Yes.
No, I just wanted to ask Abdul Sabur that, I mean, you read the sort of, I can't say development, I can't say evolution. If you will agree with me, the change in the category, right?
Yes.
My question is that how does the foundation of the category itself, which is there, it's nothing that we have invented, right? It's already there within the system that, you're trying to study. So do you, when you sort of make this very concerted and very diligent effort to trace, what it means across time, do you also think that its foundation is in itself, the naming or the creating of a category itself is in some sense located at a particular time and place which has its own, I am tempted to say politics, but I don't mean only politics. You
Of
know,
course.
what I
Yes.
mean is that language is what we are talking about. And canons, which are formed by human beings who live in societies, which obviously are underlain by politics.
Mm.
Right.
That's
So, because, you know, this is something which only a comparative perspective on literary history can achieve, which you have done for all this while that, I mean, like, you have introduced us to the fact that you can do it. So I'm just trying to, you know, push you to think, where does the category come from? You know, because your entire
yes.
writing of history and conceptualization of the whole idea itself would be
Yes.
underlain by where the category comes from and what, you know, sort of your position is vis-a-vis the category itself.
Yeah.
Because I think what we are trying to look at in this conference is just that we haven't imagined our history as plural anyway.
Yes.
So all the framework that we have and all the tools that we have are fixed to some kind of a binary. I mean, even though this is a different kind of an imperial relationship, is it an imperial relationship? What do we mean by cultural imperialism from our perspective? And is that the
Yes.
only way of looking at it? I mean, I find it very interesting that Ghalib considered his Persian ghazals, which we cannot read. But for us, he is sort of the epitome of Indian writing at a particular juncture when the idea of India is being formed. I mean, we don't think of it as in the 19th century, frankly. We don't think of it before the 19th century. But the 18th century is a period in which, I mean, there is the presence not of binaries, but of a kind of, you know, negotiation, a dialogue, a conversation, as Asit was saying.
Mm.
So, I mean, since you have the acumen of tracing history in such a subtle and fine manner, and I think we just saw the
Thank you.
top of it. I mean, you can go much deeper than this, I'm certain.
Yes.
So that is the reason why I'm thinking that, you know, these are arguments developed across time from a very fixed perspective that does not
Mm.
actually understand the idea of, I think, Hindustan or Hindi for that matter.
True.
You
That's
know,
true.
it's
Yes.
kind of defined for us. And as you said, I mean, as you said that, or as I think Farooqi says in that Strangers in the City
Yes.
essay, he says that Shibli Nomani, I mean, sort of killed these people by, you know, putting them in a particular slot that is
Oh, yes. Exactly.
whatever it is. So, I mean, I'm sorry, this like, I'm trying to tell you that you have the talent to do something which is very important. So please think about it.
You're very kind. Okay. I'll definitely look into these ideas and I'll explore them. And I hope to do justice to your faith in me.
Well, very well pointed out by Shpita, and very good observation on her part. And as they are the young scholars, you are going to answer, or it's okay? So,
Yes, ma'am. Please continue.
okay, so if you have to answer, you can. And what I'm saying, that Ishpita's point was very well presented, and this is a very relevant question about the canons and categories. So, in which we have put the different forms of literature, and from different places, from different nations, and from different languages, and that is what is the purpose of comparative literature, to explore. And so I must thank Ishpita for this observation, and also for this query, and for these ideas which she has shared here. Anybody else? Yes? Any other question, or should I go ahead with my own observation on the papers? Okay. So all these three papers were presented by the young scholars in this session, and as we are running behind the time, so I would like to conclude in brief. The first paper by Abdul Sabur Qidwai he has presented in his paper the evolution of Sabke Hindi, the Indian style of Persian poetry, which later shaped the Urdu poetic tradition. And also he traces the subsequent influences of Mirza Ghalib and his spiritual ustad or mentor, you can say, Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil, Azimabadi, in the further ramifications of Sabke Hindi and the vice versa, and also looking at what the Persian Urdu poetics also. The second, it was a very good, very well presented paper, very good paper. I must appreciate, as Spita has, that at this age, when you can write a paper like that, you can achieve much more than this. The other paper was presented by Asit Kumar Biswal, and it is also a very but it is a different subject topic, a little different from what we are discussing, Arabic Persian poetics, but he has very well pointed out the nazms on Taj Mahal written by different poets and the different writers from time to time, and beginning his deliberations with the binaries of self and other, he has delved deep into the genre of nazms, specifically written on the topic of Taj Mahal by many poets like Sahil Ludhianvi, Kafi Azmi, Mahshar Badayuni, Parveen Shakir, and many others. By comparing the aesthetics of each poem through the dialogue between the self and the other, and has shown how each poem differs from other. This paper has explored the poetics of presenting the same object of imitation in different ways, as the author himself has mentioned. So, and the third paper was, this is my observation in brief, and the third paper was presented by Brinda Das Gupta. Well, since morning we have been attending the sessions, and we started our session with Tagore and Rumi by a presentation of Professor Tapti Mukherjee, and it was a very good presentation. So it's beautiful on the part of Brinda to take up this topic, and in her paper, she has foregrounded the influence of Persian poetry and Sufism on Rabindranath Tagore. She has brought this to our knowledge. Tagore's visit to Iran and his meeting with the poet Hafiz. Actually, there are smaller facts which we are not aware with. Even I didn't know that he had visited Iran and all that about Rabindranath Tagore. Moreover, the paper explores Tagore's idea of religion, which is drawn from various sources like Baal mysticism, Sahaja Buddhism, Vedanta philosophy, and along with the Persian Sufi ideas. So all of you have presented and written good papers and presented it in a very nice manner, and I congratulate you and thank you all. With this, I conclude this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. The organizing people, that is Sahitya Klai, are you there?
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
just wanted to ask, like, how do parallel sessions work? There is a link for parallel sessions, but there is just one link.
I have just posted the link of the parallel session that will be happening from 2:30 p.m. And I have posted that link here in the chat box. And there is also another parallel session that is 3B.
There are two sessions which are parallel. Yeah, there is not another parallel session. There are two sessions which are parallel.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, which is which? Which is which? This one is which, and that one is which?
Can I interrupt for a while? Yeah.
Yes.
So the schedule mentions two sets of sessions. One is, let's say one is 2A, another is 2B. All of the A's, 2A, 3A, 4A, all of this will happen in the other link, the one that we were joining with yesterday. And this one will have the 2A, 2B, 3B, 4B, and so on.
This is a B link.
Yeah.
And that is the A link. A, B is not there. Is it there?
In the
there
schedule,
in the program?
In the schedule, yes.
It is there. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That is one and first and second. Acha, theek hai.